So I have today Dr. Gubernatis, who's a retired scientist from Los Alamos National Laboratory in the US, in New Mexico. So I will first give a short introduction of Dr. Gubernatis, and later he's going to give his talk. So Dr. Gubernatis got his Bachelor of Science in Physics degree from Loyola College, and his master and PhD from Case Western Reserve University. After completing postdoctoral work at Cornell University, he went to Los Alamos National Laboratory as a staff member and retired after 43 years, and now he's a guest scientist at that institution. His research career spanned fields such as quantitative, non-destructive evaluation via elastic wave scattering, quantum Monte Carlo methods and simulation, machine learning for material design and discovery. But today, and he co-authored 2 books on quantum Monte Carlo, method, algorithm for lattice, model and database, method for material design and discovery, basic ideas and general method. He's a past chair of the American Physical Society Division of Computational Physics and IUPAP Commission on Computational Physics, and he's also a fellow of the American Physical Society and the South African Institute of Physics. From the APS, he received a John Whitley Award for his contribution to the development of physics across the globe and in Africa in particular. But what he's going to talk about today is what he's co-founded, which is the APS African Physics Newsletter. And we are very happy to hear a little bit more about it. So Dr. Gubernatis, if you can share your slide and start your talk.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, Steve, thank you very much for the introduction, and hopefully we can get the sharing to work again.
Yeah.
Okay. And okay, I have to do this now. All right.
Okay.
The beginning. Okay, so what I want to do today is present my personal perspectives on the state of physics in Africa, mainly based on my experiences with the African Physics Newsletter. When I say personal perspectives, I just want to make it clear that although the newsletter is something that's published by the American Physical Society, I'm not an employee of the Physical Society. So what I'm not doing today is given the official position of the Physical Society on any matter. But my basic perspective is that physics in the Africa is on the upswing. So it's a very positive view. So what I'm going to do is start by introducing the newsletter, briefly review how it got started, and kind of discuss the communication issues it's trying to resolve. I'll then talk about kind of the main themes of the content of the newsletter and give some highlights of the past issues. I'm going to have to be very limited in terms of what I can highlight, but I'm going to talk about articles that we've had which points to the growth of physics infrastructure in Africa, the growth in the number of conferences, workshops, schools, etc., and also highlight some stories about African women in physics. I'll conclude by discussing what I see are some of the challenges and opportunities for the future of physics in Africa. In particular, what I will talk about is today's ability to do virtual participation, in meetings, etc., that are held not only within Africa, but between Africa and countries outside of Africa. I see such participations as an opportunity to boost the state of physics in Africa. Now, how did the newsletter get started? Okay, well, first of all, it got sort of my experience with physics in Africa got started when I was the chair of this commission on computational physics of IUPAP. One of my commission members was Nithya Chetty, and was sort of like the day after I officially became chair, he contacted me about a proposal he wanted to submit to IUPAP for a series of schools on teaching people electronic structure methods in their applications. The very next day, Kennedy Reed, who just became the chair of the Commission on Development, contacted me. The Commission on Development is the commission in IUPAP, which all proposals from developing countries pass through, get reviewed and ranked. And so Kennedy was calling other commission chairs to see whether or not there was some sort of project that the two commissions could work on. And well, obviously, Nithia's proposal was sitting on my desk. We succeeded in basically getting IUPAP support for the start of that school. Now, this experience in Africa led to my being named to a member of the American Physical Society's Commission on International Scientific Affairs, the CISA committee. The chair of the APS's director of international affairs, Amy Flatten, asked me to think about projects which CISA could sponsor for Africa. Now, I was quote unquote the African expert, even though I knew very, very little. It's just basically saying other people know even less. And I think that's kind of important to basically realize. And so I took a look at the kind of projects CISA was sponsoring. They were sponsoring projects between the American Physical Society and the Physical Society of another country, countries like Brazil, Cuba, Lebanon, China, etc. And these are visitor exchange programs, or sort of a visiting lecture from the US, visiting that particular country. And I really couldn't see how this would fit into Africa, because number one, it's very big, there are many countries, but also these projects had a memo of understanding between the American Physical Society and the Physical Society of a country that they're working with. And so I started to ask myself, how many physical societies are there in Africa? And only one I was certain of was the South African Institute for Physics. So I started making phone calls and sending out email. And I discovered that even people who were much more knowledgeable about Africa than I was couldn't really answer definitively how many physical societies there were in Africa. So what I did was I suggested to Amy that the project for CISA should be conducting a survey of the physics in Africa, just to see basically what was happening. And from that survey, identify areas where the American Physical Society could work with African physical societies to kind of define projects. Now, what she actually did was she contacted her counterpart at the Institute of Physics in United Kingdom, the European Physical Society, and the ICTP. So this kind of became a three-organization survey. And the survey did reveal a number of areas where you could kind of see people getting together and more sharply defining the projects. But unfortunately, the only thing that got any follow-up on was issues associated with communication. And I linked back up with Nithya Chetty, who was now in Wits University in South Africa. And we proposed to Amy that a project for CISA would be starting a newsletter in Africa. She was supportive of the idea and got the CEO of the Physical Society to approve. And so in October of 2018, we got approval to do the newsletter, and on the 2nd of February 2019, we published our first issue. Yes. Sorry, I couldn't quite understand you.
Oh, no, sorry, it was someone left his microphone open. Sorry, you can continue.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay, so what were kind of the communication issues revealed through the survey? And I think that some of these issues still remain to today. And I think some have improved a great deal. And I'm not going to claim the newsletter basically made that improvement. But I think basically what the newsletter has done is allow us to kind of see that improvement. And one of the issues is that it seems like communication among physicists in a given country is often poor. How I communicate with other physicists in my country is through by research collaborations. The American Physical Society conducts a number of meetings in a year. They have a number of newsletters they publish. They have a website, etc. But what one discovered is most countries in Africa don't have a physical society. And those countries which do have a physical society, those physical societies are relatively small. At the end of our survey with a newsletter, we discovered there were at least 9 physical societies in Africa. And now there are at least 15. Now, all these societies claim to meet at least once a year, but the physical societies in South Africa and Nigeria are the ones that, at least I'm aware of, that meet at least yearly, but also publish a newsletter. What one discovered was the physical society's websites are updated on a casual basis. I can remember going to one physical society website. It was a very nice website announcing about a meeting that IUPAP was funding in that particular country. But when I looked at the date of the meeting, it had occurred 2 years ago. Now, so these websites do take time to update. And one would basically guess, since these societies are very small, that volunteers are doing this. And hence, people are very busy and can't always do certain kind of things. And again, South African Institute of Physics is likely the only society that has paid employees, and the number of such employees is 3. So in a lot of countries, don't have enough physicists to form a society. The societies are small. And so just communication within a country, it seems like that's an area which basically could be improved upon. Now, the communication between the countries, one discovered that is often very poor, even among neighboring countries. And that could be due to a number of factors. One factor could be simply that the different countries speak different languages. But on the other hand, there seem to be very few established, fully Pan-African physics organizations and societies, organizations that would lay atop the country a kind of a natural network to communicate between different countries all across the continent, or even within certain regions. Also, what one discovered was the communication between African and non-African physicists and societies is often weak. The number of responses to survey questions said, we wish the major physical societies would do this, that, or the other thing, or in fact, they were doing it. It's just basically people weren't aware of it. And how can you start communicating to the people who could take advantages of these services, other than devising a better means to communicate with them? Now, the other aspect is that what one didn't really see, it was a great deal of activity. But we started the newsletter with basically the belief was that there was actually a lot of activity, even though not readily apparent. And the amount of activity was sufficient to warrant a newsletter devoted to the physics in Africa. So again, it got started in 2019. The newsletter is something that's published quarterly. It's distributed by email. You don't have to be a physicist to subscribe, and it doesn't cost anything. Now, an important point is that the news items are gathered, selected, and edited by an editorial board of African physicist volunteers. Basically, we have 2 editors for each of the 5 geographic regions of Africa, and we handle the diaspora in a slightly different fashion. Okay. Now, the point is that the APS doesn't provide any content to the newsletter. It's the African physics community which provides the contact. And basically all the APS does, it does some of the final copy editing, formatting, and it distributes it. So again, we're trying to make this a newsletter about African physics as told by the African physicists. Now, if you were to take a look at the content of the various issues, one of the things I think the newsletter is doing is kind of providing a unifying view of physics in Africa. If you only have like 15 physical societies spread among 55 countries in this big continent, these pockets of physics activity are widely separated, but also the countries are very diverse. Okay, there's a lot of diversity with respect to the dominant religions, the principal languages, the state of the economy, the state of the government, the geography, etc. So it's kind of unifying all that. And the content of the newsletter seems to be more like that of a physical society of a medium-sized developed country. In that we have announcements of conferences, schools, workshops, degree programs, highlights of experimental facilities, recent noteworthy publications, promotions, awards, etc. So these are the typical kinds of things that you see in a newsletter of a society like the American Physical Society. Another society I belong to is the Society for Industrial and Applied Mathematics. These newsletters all seem to be kind of have very similar content. On the other hand, from time to time, we've had issues with a special focus. During the pandemic, there weren't any, height of the pandemic, there weren't any conferences, schools, or workshops taking places. Universities were shut down. These kinds of other things were basically canceled. But we did have articles about the African physics response to the pandemic. Articles by faculty members talking about how they had to adjust the way that they taught courses and interacted with the students and did their research. Then the articles from the students, basically how they had to adjust their learning process, their research, etc. Other things, such as the response of the physicists at more of a technical level, doing simulations of the spread of the pandemic, using 3D printing to create face shields and things of this nature. We also have gone in and asked to have information articles on very specific topics to kind of give people a sense and feel how things were going in, what was being done in certain important areas. Areas such as quantum computing and information, women in physics, medical physics, climate change, etc. Now, again, these articles are written by the American physicists. If I were to take a look at, let's say, the newsletter of the American Physical Society, members of the society do contribute some of the articles, but most of the articles are written by staff writers or journalists who are hired to write an article on a particular topic. And so consequently, the articles in the newsletter are often more personal statements about a physicist's journey to their degree or their current position, a more personal statement about the description of their research, their vision for physics in Africa, etc. So the content of the newsletter is much about who are the physicists in Africa as about what they are doing. This was not planned, but I think it's a very positive feature of the newsletter. Now, kind of give you some more highlights from the newsletter. The first thing I want to talk about is what type of content caught my attention and supports my saying that African physics is on the upswing. First of all, what you can kind of see is a growth of this physics infrastructure, the growth of these kinds of activities, which attempt to do communication within a nation, within a region, or throughout the particular content. This is, in some sense, is reflective of the fact that there's a growth in the number of and variety of conferences, workshops, and schools that are taking place. And in terms of getting a sense of who are the physicists in Africa, what are some of the challenges that they're facing, what are some of their successes. Again, you can take a look at the articles on women in physics, the responses to the pandemic, the people in the diaspora, and even basically the physics graduate students, et cetera. There's also, again, a number of articles publishing perspectives and activities directed at basically this whole issue of interfacing science and public policy. What were kind of interesting were description of a number of very outstanding laboratory facilities at several universities. But I think one of the unique things was some articles about the application of physics to agriculture. In my country, we have 50 states. And if you go to each state, there's going to be at least one university with a very big agriculture department. If I would visit my colleagues at that particular university, none of them are talking to people in the agriculture department. So I think this was kind of an interesting feature of what's taking place in Africa. And I'm not going to be able to give highlights on all these topics, but I'll just give sort of like three groupings. And the first grouping has to do with basically this infrastructure growth. And again, these all are been associated with articles in the newsletter. But I think one of the more important things that has happened is actually the establishment of this East African Institute for Fundamental Physics. This was the first of its ICTP-sponsored institute in Africa. The ICTP has maybe a half a dozen of these things throughout the world, but they now have put one into Africa, and it is kind of a center for physics in Africa. And I think that's a very important step upward. It's not only saying about where is the state of physics in Africa, but it is saying basically, people saw that the need to have this kind of center. Now, the African Materials Research Society and this African School in Electronic Structure Methods and Applications, as I mentioned earlier, then the African School of Physics, all got started about the same time. That they're now at least 12 years old, they're growing, and they have been very important in providing both supplementary and complementary parts of the education and the communication of physics within the country. And they all have achieved a certain amount of notable success. And that, again, I think is part of this growth of infrastructure. In the past 5 years, the number of national physical societies increased from 9 to 15. Of 5 of the societies in the increase, of those that increased, formed a regional physical society, the West African Physical Society. These are basically principally French-speaking countries in West Africa. It's publishing an online journal, okay? The 2 biggest countries in the world that speak Portuguese are Portugal and Brazil. Those 2 countries got together with the Portuguese-speaking countries in Africa and formed what they're calling a physics union, again, to kind of promote interaction and collaboration, but also basically to kind of preserve some of the culture, the Portuguese culture and traditions in those 2 countries. Now, the other thing that has happened is that about 3 years ago, the American Physical Society started to award what they're calling innovation grants. I mean, they call for proposals. A large number of people responded. Over the 3 years, I think they've awarded a total of 10 grants. 2 such grants have involved people in Africa, interfacing mainly with people in the US, but I think there may be some other countries involved. I sat on the review panel for the first such call for proposals, and I can assure you that these proposals were all very well written. And the fact that the African community, came out a winner in this process twice, again, is, I think, saying something about where the state of physics is in Africa. The Meerkat in South Africa is the largest radio astronomy telescope in the world. It's coming online, and as it's coming online, it's publishing articles in Nature. It's scheduled to be a component of the even larger Square Kilometer Array. Okay, it will be linked up with a radio astronomy telescope array in Australia, but this whole thing is part of a very large international consortium. So what you're going to have in South Africa is this incredible resource to do this type of research, which is going to provide research opportunities for people throughout the continent, but basically it's going to be part of a much larger research area activity throughout the world. So that's very exciting. There are now 2 journals, Scientific Africa and Nature Africa, which are specifically devoted to giving published papers from African physicists a higher profile, okay? And even more recently, there's been this African Light Foundation that was formed for people to go around and to try to establish an advanced light source in Africa. So this is what I call infrastructure growth. And I think this is pointing that things are all basically very positive in many respects, moving in outstanding directions. Now, other things in terms of what people do would get reflected by conferences, workshops, and schools. And the number of those things seems to be increasing. But I think as importantly, the nature of their sponsorship is evolving. At least when I started to go back to the survey again, The only things that you would see that was happening were conferences or workshops, etc., that were sponsored by some large organization and held maybe in a particular country in Africa. Now, while there's still a lot of these things being jointly sponsored with an outside African organization, many of these things are now being sponsored locally, regionally, or by a Pan-African cooperative. Now, the conference photograph that I have on the bottom of the slide is from a conference held in Cape Town, and I think it was like in December 2018. What it was the International Conference on Nanostructured Materials. This is a conference that's held once a year, and it moves from country to country. And this was the first time it was held in Africa, which again is a very positive thing. It is saying something about the state of nanotechnology research in Africa. There's been a number of other things, and again, these are just samples from a lot of articles. It was kind of a meeting of people getting together to establish a crystallographic association. Going back to this African School of Electronic Structure Methods and Applications, the way that thing was originally set up, it was to be held every 2 years and move from country to country, and then it would draw students from all over the continent. Now, the interest in electronic structure methods and applications in Africa is growing at a quite significant level. And so what they decided to do was now to hold some more regional conferences, and that regional conference is basically, it drew together the students from a more limited region. And this obviously opens things up to a wider number of students. It reduces the cost of travel, etc. And so here is the school photograph from the first such regional conference, which is held in Cameroon. This is a picture of a group of people who got together for the purposes of establishing an African network for solar energy, which is obviously a very important topic, not only for providing electrical services in Africa, but basically worldwide in terms of reducing carbon footprints and things of this particular nature. This is an organization involving mainly African nations in West Africa, with maybe the South African Institute of Physics and some people from some other countries. As its name says, African Scientific Integration Network, it's seeking to promote science in Africa. One of the things that they do is to hold a mathematics camp. And here's a picture of the high school students who attended a mathematics camp that was held in the country of Togo. In Kenya, they're trying to promote communications amongst physics faculty within their country. The faculty at some of the smaller universities are also some of the younger faculty members. So basically, they're trying to integrate those faculties in those universities with the more experienced faculty at the larger universities. So they have something they call the Physics Community Kenya, PC Kenya Group. So this is a few examples what I see of conferences and workshops that are taking place on quite a variety of topics where, again, some of these things are being localized within a country or within a region through a group of people trying to reach out across the continent, but there's still conferences and workshops which are being sponsored jointly with an outside organization. Now, to move on the topic of women in physics, this is an extremely important topic worldwide. In addition, it gets coupled with as equally important topic of STEM education in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics areas. In particular, with respect to STEM education, one issue is how can you do it better to attract students to get degrees in those fields? And at the same time, how can you attract portions of your population which are underrepresented with people with those degrees? And an important issue is attracting more women to those fields. And so we also had articles highlighting the research careers of outstanding African women, and also articles about the awards various African women have received. And this first picture I have here is of a high school, is of a class of a physics class at a girls' high school in Tanzania. What was observed in Tanzania was when the women went to the university and they declared their initial major, those that declared a STEM major had a smaller percentage in graduating with a STEM degree than their male counterparts. So what was done was the women physicists in a number of universities, with the help and support of some of their male colleagues, went to the high schools, helped revise the curriculum, gave suggestions to the teachers on how to teach certain topics, and even helped basically design the laboratory courses. What was discovered is that these women, when they went to the university, were better prepared. And so if they declared their initial major as a STEM, one of the STEM disciplines, the percentage of the women that started to graduate with such a degree became comparable to the male students. In terms of awards, here's a picture of a very obviously happy young lady receiving a certificate. And what the story here was she is a founding member of the Physics Association of Botswana. When that association was founded, I think they had like a total of 30 members. And what the award was being given to her was awards which the L'Oreal Corporation, this is a big cosmetic company, gives to women in sub-Saharan Africa who are outstanding women in science. And so the people in Botswana were very proud that this young lady got the award, also proud of the fact that she's the second woman from Botswana to receive such an award. So we had articles like that. Here are, again, just some samples of the titles of a few other types of articles we've had. When Women Build Bridges is not about civil engineering, actual construction of a bridge, but it's an article about a woman in one country helping a woman in a neighboring country get the funding needed to basically outfit her research laboratory. I'll probably badly mispronounce this woman's name, Raja El Morsil. This is her picture here. We had an article about her. The occasion was she was put on a list of the 50 most influential women in science in the world, okay? And she also, a number of other things highlighting basically her career. In particular, she does her research at CERN and was part of one of the teams that was involved in the discovery of the Higgs boson. She's won all kinds of awards. I think the Arab Woman Science of the Year, she's gotten another type of L'Oreal award. There's now awards named after her, okay? She was very instrumental in basically developing physics programs in Morocco. She was the chair of her physics department, now vice president. What was also kind of interesting was a story about her journey to become a physicist. She got interested in science when she watched Neil Armstrong walk on the surface of the moon, okay? Also very interested about the role of women in science when she read a story on the life of Madame Curie. So in high school, she showed a lot of promise in science and started to gravitate towards physics and decided she wanted to be a physicist and was admitted to a PhD program in France. The problem is that she comes from a very conservative community where a woman doesn't leave home until she gets married. So her father said, no, you can't go. It took a lot of people to convince her father otherwise. And so fortunately for her, she was able to pursue her dream. But I think also importantly, she's obviously had a big impact on science, in particular, science in Morocco. There are other kinds of awards given to women in physics. The Schlumberger Foundation gives awards to women so they can pursue a PhD in physics or a postdoctoral appointment. And so this young lady here in Cameroon received one of these awards where she was able to do a postdoc in basically the area of physics education and STEM education. The other articles about journeys to become a scientist, as I mentioned, that these innovation grants, 2 of them involve people in Africa. An article about one of them, there's a group called Women Supporting Women in Science. They received one of these awards to basically develop low-cost lab kits to be used in primary and secondary education in each Africa. The last thing I want to talk about has to do with this article, from a small village in Madagascar to a physics superwoman. Okay, here's the physics superwoman. But again, it was quite interesting to see kind of the tenacity it took for her to basically get her PhD. From a small village, this is a small farming village where people grew rice and potatoes. She showed a lot of promise in high school, and her teachers encouraged her to go to a university in the capital of Madagascar. Her parents were very supportive, but to do that, she first had to make a transition from basically speaking an indigenous language to French, going from a small town to a big city, going from an educational city environment, which was not as sophisticated as what she was going to, which when she went to the university, she had never used a computer before. She got her undergraduate degree, did a master's degree in Madagascar, but then at the end of that degree, she applied to this electronic structure school, was admitted. That school lasts for 2 weeks. And at the end, they make various awards. She received the Most Improved Student Award. My colleague, Nithya, hired her as a PhD student. She got a PhD with him, did a postdoc in France. And I guess at the time of this article, she was hoping to land a faculty position somewhere. So these are just kind of a little bit of a survey of the kinds of articles that we have, which basically reveal what is being done in physics in Africa, but also information about who are the people doing this. And I think of particular interest, it has to do with respect to what were some of the challenges these people had to face to basically become a physicist. But now looking ahead, I'm shifting my attention to what do I see as the challenges to physics in Africa. I don't think I'm telling anybody anything new, that the biggest challenges are basically economic. The World Bank used to classify the countries in the world as being developed or developing. More recently, they have a 4-tiered system. Of the 28 poorest countries in the world, 25 are in Africa. The next 54 poorest, 52 are in Africa. The next 54, 7 are. There's only one of what they would call 81 high-income countries in the world that involves African countries, and that's the Seychelles Islands. Now, that's probably a lovely place to vacation, but it's not a hotbed in physics. So consequently, the big challenge is that many countries just don't have the income to support the basic sciences, including physics. And so that's a real problem. And what it leads to is the following more specific problem. This is from an article that I found on the BBC webpage. The title of the article kind of says it all. African brain drain. 90% of my friends want to leave. First sentence of the abstract. A new survey of more than 4,500 young people in Africa aged 18 to 24 has found that 52% of them are likely to consider emigrating in the next few years, citing economic hardship and educational opportunities as the top region. Now, this 5,400 were not all people in physics or even in a STEM major, but it's basically pointing to, I think it's something that's an alarming shame. It does translate into the fact that many youth in Africa are faced with a lack of opportunity to pursue a meaningful career in a technological field if they go through all the time and effort to get a degree in a STEM field or in physics in particular. What you really would like to be able to do is attract as many people as possible into those fields and into physics in particular. And that's going to be basically a real challenge to kind of overcome this kind of issue, which certainly would have to make people think twice if you're not going to have technological careers to go into, then why major in a technological field? There are other challenges to physics in Africa. Government officials and the general public often do not understand science and see its benefits. Now, in one of our articles in the newsletter was a story told by an African mathematical physicist. When I turned up for my first faculty job, the dean asked me what field I was in. I replied, quantum field theory. He said, "Oh, we're not an agricultural university. Is there something else you can do?" Now, the one point that one can make is this lack of appreciation and understanding of science and its benefits is kind of a universal problem. I've never seen a case as bad as this story implies, but even in my particular country during the pandemic, it was basically disappointing to see the number of people who wouldn't listen to the recommendations from our medical scientists about what they should be doing to take care of their health and avoid the spread of the pandemic, and essentially the mistrust that they had in what they were saying. And this was even more discouraging when the vaccines came out, of people not taking them because they didn't trust them. A lot of people got very sick or died as a consequence. I would say part of the problem is that we scientists in general do a poor job, or at least an insufficient job, to change that type of situation. So I think one of the challenges to the physics community anywhere is to be mindful of this and to take advantage of any kind of opportunity you have to basically to kind of educate the public a bit more about what you're doing and why is it important, and basically why should it care. Now, in terms of looking to the future, perhaps in a more positive fashion, what I would say is that virtual meetings have become a fixture for every major scientific society in every major country. And the rise of virtual attendance in workshops, international workshops, conferences, and schools is probably one of the few positive consequences I think you can have with respect to the pandemic. And so I think it's going to be very important for scientists all over and scientists in Africa in particular to seize the opportunity that these types of virtual attendance provides for engaging with other physicists, both within your continent or between continents. And if you can do that, this is going to enrich your physics and create a higher visibility for it. And it could help you basically with the appreciation of the general public for what you're doing. Again, if we go back to this young lady from Botswana receiving this particular award, it was a matter of great pride, not only to the physics community in Botswana, but the community in Botswana in general. It did give a message to the government that the money they were putting into science was having a positive, basically, payoff. Now, there's been a few things of engagements I'd like to point out. One, what's happening in Africa is this African strategy for fundamental and applied physics, which is basically taking people from all over Africa in the various subfields of physics, meeting pretty much virtually, as far as I understand, attempting to define lists of research projects. I believe the overall intent is to ultimately come out with a final report, which then can be presented to government leaders, in particular those in the African Union, to help kind of define science policies for Africa and the country in Africa. Right now, the African Union says each country should be spending 1% of its gross domestic product on research, but it doesn't say what type of research. So what they're trying to do, I think in part, is to get a bit more funding going into some of the basic science areas. The second group to receive one of these innovation grants had to do with people coming from this electronic school and structure initiative, which does involve some people here at the East African Institute. They were going to have two big meetings. First one where people from outside Africa were coming to Africa to meet the scientists there to discuss collaborations. Then people from another meeting where it would, by and large, have people from Africa going to that particular conference. The pandemic basically made the first such meeting totally virtual, the second meeting hybrid. But it does basically point out to the fact that you can accomplish things in a virtual or hybrid type of mode. It's maybe not the best of things, but a lot basically can be done. I also want to mention something else the APS is experimenting with. It's something called International Youth Leadership Forums. These are all done virtually, but the APS has had a tradition of international leadership forums involving senior people. And so what they're doing is having one just involving the youth. I've received information about doing these things, and I passed them on to the editors of our newsletter. And there's been a number of African students participating in these things. I think there were 2 on the first such forums, 5 on the second. In general, the feedback you got from the youth that this was the greatest experience of their life up to that particular point. One positive feature is basically the youth sees other youth, and many of the problems that they're facing are universal. Okay, but they also had an opportunity to express to the leaders of the APS what were some of the specific issues associated with being a graduate student or a postdoc or a young faculty member in Africa. Going back to the issue of virtual attendance of workshops, conferences, and schools, what the APS is also doing is testing pilot programs for free virtual institutional attendance of the March meetings. By this, what I mean is that for certain institutions, several people at that institution are given a free virtual registration to the March meeting, which then would enable them to live stream the meeting or replay the recorded sessions. They did it for 4 institutions last year, 2 in India, but in Africa, there was one here associated with the East African Institute and one associated with Wits University. Now, they're going to be doing this again this year. I don't think all the plans are in place, but it's going to include more countries throughout the world. I think the East African Institute will be hosting one of these things again. But this is basically an opportunity to basically see what's happening at the March meeting, which is the largest meeting of physicists in the world. And so you can see, in real time, in some cases, people present papers in fields and topics that you're interested in. Now, which I think is even more interesting, and this is something I just basically learned about, is the APS has instituted tier registration fees for its March and April meetings. What this means is that if you come from one of these low income or low medium income countries, according to the World Bank classification, you can register for these meetings at an 89% discount. You don't have to have visas, okay? I mean, again, if you virtual participation of these meetings means you also don't have to pay travel costs. And so this puts the cost of a virtual registration probably more within the economic means of the people in those countries. If you're from a high medium income category, I think the discount is 72%. So this, I think, is huge. And so I would kind of encourage you to look into that a bit more and take advantage of it if that basically kind of suits your interest. Now, let me start to close by saying that my views of physics in Africa are largely based on the writings in the newsletter as read as an outsider to the community. If I talk to other outsiders who are reading the newsletter, their views are very similar to mine. What I don't have a sense and feel for is how do insiders view themselves. Hopefully they also would see themselves in this very positive fashion. And again, I think it's important to remember the newsletter is telling not just what physics is being done, but also telling the stories of the people who are doing it. And what comes across is the people who are doing it are not only talented, but are very committed to be physicists and very determined to succeed. And the last thing I'll say is why many challenges face physics in Africa, and more beyond those that I listed, I believe its people are what gives the future of physics promise. And so I'm done, except I'll just flash this view graph. If you haven't subscribed to the newsletter and would like to, you can do so by going to this link. If you'd like to contribute news articles, the best thing to do is contact our editor-in-chief, Stefan Kenmo, and here is his email address. So thank you for your time and your attention.
Thank you, Jim, for this very nice presentation. And now the room is open for anyone who has questions, wants to know a little bit more specific queries about the African Physics newsletter. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question. Any question? Anyone who has a question about the physics newsletter, feel free to unmute yourself.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes. Can you introduce yourself and ask your question, please?
I think there is a problem.
Yes. Is that Felana? Any question about the African Physics newsletter?
Good afternoon, Professor. Good afternoon.
Yes.
Hello.
Can you introduce yourself first?
Yes,
please?
my name is Christian Emen from Cameroon. I am a PhD, and I want to ask a question to Professor Jamezi.
Yes.
Yeah, Professor, thank you for this kind presentation. My question is about the APS March meeting. Last year, we have some free trials, and APS used some satellite to present the meeting in Africa and to other institutes through the EAIFR program. Which facility do APS will use this year to diffuse or to transmit the APS mission of this year? Which facility?
Okay, the information I got from them just on this past Monday was that wasn't settled yet. That was something they were still basically working on. It seemed like within Africa, they will probably repeat these things through the East African Institute and the South African Institute of Physics. So it won't just be at Wits University in South Africa. They were talking about, they did a couple in India. They're going to be doing those again. Then they mentioned doing something in South Africa. One of the things that they said would be one at Sesame, okay, in Jordan, the light source there. But I don't think that, so again, this is not fully settled yet. I think in terms of, my guess is you'll probably see one at the through the East African Institute. And so it's just then becomes a question of basically you're being able to access the how it was set up. Not too sure how it was set up. In South Africa last year, they did it. Everybody went to Wits University and they did it in one room. I think for East Africa Institute, people had to log into things. But anyhow, these are things that you probably should just talk with the people at the East African Institute about. But I wish I could tell you a lot more. They're also going to do these youth forums again this year, but they haven't decided on the when that's basically going to be done. But the other thing is that you can yourself register virtually at a big discount. So if you can kind of afford to do that, that's very good. Or you can get a bunch of people. One person registers, you go to that person's apartment and watch the thing being streamed live. But the other point is that those talks at the March meeting a lot of them are recorded, and you can replay the recorded talks at sort of your convenience up to maybe a couple weeks period, because there is a time zone difference between that's quite significant between the March meeting. This year is going to be held in Las Vegas, and in most countries in Africa. Like, for instance, I started my talk at 7 a.m. okay, this morning, my time, and whereas like 4 p.m. your time. So yeah, anyhow, I think I wish I could tell you more information. I just don't have it.
Please,
So
I have
they-
a second question, please.
Go ahead.
Professor, as the African Physics Journal has been created, which kind of article can we publish there? And why is the impact of this, is it for condensed matter or all the field of physics? And where is the impact factor of this journal? Is it a good thing that will help us improve our publication?
Well, I think basically, first of all, this is a newsletter, it's not a journal. That's, I think, one important thing to remember. I think one of the impacts it's been precisely the fact that they're now doing this tiered registration. I honestly think that people just didn't realize what kind of activity was taking place in Africa and what were kind of the economic challenges. It'd be a little bit hard for me to bring up that World Bank list again, but the cutoff, the bottom income of a high income countries is the poverty level in most countries. And so if you have most of the African nations sitting much below that, that's saying something quite significant. I just don't think people kind of appreciated what was happening there. I think other things that has been positive about this newsletter is that this CISA committee that I mentioned early on, at that time, again, I was the only person who knew anything about Africa, and it wasn't much, okay? I'm not on that committee anymore, but there are 3 people on it now who know a lot more about Africa than I do. Professor Glenhill from South Africa is on it. Joe Niemela from the ICTP is on it. He's traveled extensively in Northern and Western Africa, does collaborative research with people there. And Beth, forget her last name. She is the editor of the American Journal of Physics. She spent a sabbatic year in Uganda and is very familiar with conditions in Uganda and in neighboring countries. So I think it's had an impact with respect on the people outside, understanding a bit more about what are some of the issues that they're facing their colleagues in Africa. I would hope at the same time the newsletter has provided a mechanism for people in different countries in Africa to see what else is happening elsewhere. And I would think that that's the case. It's one of the few large email lists for all of Africa. So it's hard to measure the impact, I think, in a quantitative sense, but I do think, at least from what people have told me, is that they are enjoying reading the newsletter. And these are people not only outside of Africa, but people basically inside Africa.
Okay, there's a question from Omolulu, but it's written in the chat. He's wondering if you will be aware of any efforts in Africa to apply physics in needy areas such as agriculture or health.
Yeah, as I mentioned, that there have been several articles talking about applications that would be related to agriculture or livestock. Okay, there was an article about some people in Egypt using nuclear magnetic resonance, I think, basically to do certain kinds of analysis. I forget precisely what it was. Maybe it was the perhaps the diseases in animals. There was an article about to kind of inhibit poaching of rhinoceroses, implanting the horns of the rhinoceros, which are valued in some Asian countries as aphrodisiacs, with radioactive materials, which basically would render them useless. And so the issues there where physicists were working on was understanding what would be good isotopes that wouldn't pose a danger to the animal, but still basically render the horns useless for this kind of resale value. There were some articles, I think it was in Senegal. I guess one of the things they produce are peanuts or something of this particular fashion. And then you have the shell from the peanuts. It's sort of, what can you do with those shells? And they were converting it to biomasses, which they then could use, burn, and basically help generate electricity with that. So there were those kinds of articles. I think the version of these view graphs that I sent you originally have some slides in there which are hidden. And one of the slides did contain the name of some articles, but that was one of the slides. I just didn't have time to show all this stuff. The biggest problem given this talk was doing something which have taken 2 hours and squeezing it down to 50 minutes. Okay.
So now I'll probably ask question, but if anyone has a question, feel free to ask. So what is the connection between the African Physics newsletter and African society in each country? Do you have common interaction? Do you often communicate with each other? How does that work? Is there something that is being developed? Or?
I mean, the newsletter with African physical societies?
Yes, not the African Physical Society, but the country-wise African physical societies.
Okay, you mean like there is something called the African Physical Society. I mean, what's the relationship between the newsletter and that society?
Yes, with that one and with societies also in each African country, the 15 that you mentioned. Okay. Are there any communication?
Well, there is some communication in terms of the African Physical Society, but the newsletter has an advisory committee. And one of the members of the advisory committee is Amadou Wagwe, who's the president of the African Physical Society. So we have some communication with him in that regard. I would say the communication with, there's been a couple attempts to reach out to specific physical societies to improve communication, and in part to get contributions to the newsletter from those societies. And unfortunately, that hasn't worked. In some cases, the people simply not responded to my email. I just don't know the reason why. But if you get down to the South African Institute, there's a lot of very good communication. Nithya Chetty, one of the co-founders of the newsletter, is a past president of the African Institute of Physics. And one of our long-term editors, Igor Glenhill from South Africa, is also a past president of the South African Institute of Physics. And she's still actively involved in a number of committees with that particular society. So we have good interaction there. But in general, we don't have interaction per se with a physical society. At one time, I have to appoint editors to the newsletter. At one time, I offered a particular physical society an editor position. Okay, you name who you would want from your society to be an editor. Never got an email response. So I think that's something that one would basically like to improve a bit. It's been quite an effort to get things up to this particular point. Okay, we are moving ahead, and I would hope in the future we can do even more than we're currently doing.
Another question, you mentioned the two journals, Scientific African and Nature African.
Right.
So that's more or less the same kind of question. Would you encourage African scientists to try to publish in those journals? Because I guess to some extent, you have a newsletter, like the APS has a newsletter, but is there any effort that you're aware of to try to develop like physical, well-known physical review within Africa and encourage scientists in Africa to try to publish their research in those specific journal? Or
okay, there's a multifaceted question that's maybe not apparent to begin with. First of all, there is a journal called the African Physical Review, which is an online journal that's published through the ICTP. And that's been going on for a while. I don't think that's a journal which is widely known, but it is a mechanism where an African physicist can publish. The Scientific African, I think, does publish sort of original articles, that is, say, articles which haven't been published elsewhere. I'm not overly familiar with it, but then the Nature Physics, the Nature African Journal, what that does, it has an editorial board which looks through all journals that are published, and then it identifies articles which are published, at least in part, by an African scientist, and invites people to write a more short, more readable version of the article. So it's not that publication itself. Okay, so it's bringing those publications to a wider readership in a more readable fashion. Now, in terms of the American Physical Society, we have the Physical Review that it publishes. As part of these leadership forums, what the students were able to do is to talk with editors of some of those journals to get an idea of what the editorial process is like. And so if they would submit articles, they are more aware of what they need to do, what's kind of involved in the review process, what's kind of involved in responding to the editor process. Now, also, there are people you can contact in the APS who you can ask to basically give you presentations about their journals and this whole issue of publishing. And I think I forget the guy's name, is Matthias somebody. I think he has talked to people at this African School for Physics, as part of their meeting, has given a presentation on how to increase your chances to publishing in these journals simply by being more familiar with the process. And I think also he has gone to some universities and made, or at least virtually, and made those presentations. I think he has done, for instance, one of these things at Wits University. So I think you can basically make yourself a bit more competitive with respect to an article that you submit by understanding what the process is and how you should address issues, particularly how you should respond to referees' reports, which is the big problem. Okay.
So probably that would be my last question.
Okay.
So what would you, if people are interested and one would like to contribute to the African Physics newsletter, because I feel, and that's probably also the purpose of this meeting, is first for people to know a little bit more about it and also try to contribute as much as possible, because there's still a lack of knowledge about physics activities in some parts of Africa. Like, if someone would like to contribute, first of all, what kind of topic will you invite in the newsletter, and how to actually contribute to the newsletter?
Okay, well, the last thing is simply what one has to do is to contact one of our editors. And again, the simplest thing is to contact the editor-in-chief. Okay, he can maybe direct that person to the regional editor. But I think basically, see, it's not so much what I want, me personally. It's basically what the African physics community wants. Okay, and so this then is going to be based on what the editors wanted to see. And we've had, I think, we're very open with respect to the types of articles we publish, but we're not a journal, so we can't publish, we don't want to publish something, we can't publish an entire research article or even a small research article, because we don't want to be in a position of reviewing those things. And you also have page limits on the sides of the articles. But again, if you're going to hold a conference or workshop in your country, that's certainly the case. Somebody in your country has received an award or been promoted to the president of the university or something of this particular fashion. These are the kinds of things that one can basically handle. And so we're very open in that regard. And in part, the job of the editor-in-chief would be to work with the other editors in the author to basically adjust things so it comes in somewhat suitable. So again, we're very open. We just basically want to hear what the community is doing, thinking, and feeling. And hopefully this is a mechanism where one can express that not only to your colleagues in Africa, but we do have a relatively large readership outside of Africa. And it's not all of the diaspora, it's a lot of other people out there who are interested in what's happening in Africa.
Okay, I think if there are no more questions, I would like to thank you once more for this presentation. And
Another question, I think.
yeah, is there another question?
Yes.
Sustain? Yes, go on.
Okay, my name is Sunday Joseph, a student of East African Institute. Okay. So we are grateful for the presentation and the awareness created. In the presentation, there's this aspect you actually made a good observation as to one of the challenges of growth of physics in Africa, which has to do with income. And I'm looking at the area of open science with regards to access to good papers in journals. Mm-hmm. Is there any effort towards making access to journals relatively cheap or relatively easy for African society in high-profile journals where we know it's a bit expensive for researchers in Africa to access?
Yeah, that's a very good point. And again, I've been asked this question a number of times, through the people of this African School of Electronic Structure Methods and Applications. I mean, again, I'm kind of on the advisory board for that particular school. It's something that when I was on the CISA committee, that I raised it a number of times in those committee meetings. Now, I can't discuss the conversations in those particular meetings because there's certain kind of confidentiality things they have to respect. But it is something that people are aware of. And I think the problem is that they don't quite know how to handle it. What I guess is the case is that there is a mechanism that's operated through the ICTP where an individual can request a copy of an article from most any journal around, and then you get sent that copy. That's not the same thing as having access to the entire journal, but at least to get you a copy of the article. So I wish I could tell you more. All I can do is assure you that I'm not the only one that has expressed this concern and need, but I think it's just more of an issue. They don't know quite how to handle it. Again, this issue of having tiered structures for registration of these meetings, I mean, I would claim that I've kind of planted the seeds of some of those ideas, and I was just elated when I saw that they actually now has this thing. This is, I think, a huge step forward. So I think people are trying to do the best they can, but in some cases, they may not know what to do, or change just basically takes a certain amount of time to accomplish things. So if I see some of these people back at the APS again, I'll mention that this is still a concern and basically a need. The beautiful picture of a tree. What kind of tree is that? I mean,
Yeah, I don't know.
I don't actually know the name.
Okay, it's beautiful. Okay.
Okay, so thanks again, Jim, for this very nice presentation. I see that the editor-in-chief that was mentioned, Dr. Stefan Clinmore, is online as well. And if you have any contribution you want to make, feel free to email him. And thanks again for this presentation. It will be uploaded on the YouTube channel of the East African Institute for Fundamental Research in the next couple of days. So thanks again for joining and for attending. And thank you, Jim, for the presentation.
Well, thank you for the invitation. I enjoyed making the invitation. I just didn't know quite what to say. I mean, again, I'd like for people to read the newsletter, but I also want to put forth the message that I think the newsletter is painting a positive picture of physics in Africa, and I hope people basically appreciate that. So again, thank you for your time and your attention.
Thank you so much.
Okay, all right, bye.
Bye.